I was checking the hives the morning the little girl walked into my field and sat down in the grass like she'd always belonged there. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She walked straight toward the hives without hesitating, and she didn't look scared at all. "Hey, my name is Eli Shaw. I'm 34 years old, and I live on the edge of Graymore, Vermont, a town small enough that everyone knows which truck belongs to who, and nobody locks their doors before October. I keep bees, 42 hives on 6 acres of clover and wildflower I've been tending for 11 years. My marriage ended 3 years ago. It just stopped, the way a fire stops when there's nothing left to burn. Rachel moved to Burlington. I stayed. I had the bees and the land and the house my grandfather built, and I told myself that was enough. Most days I believed it. I wasn't looking for anything to change that September morning, but something had already walked through the gap in my fence. She had dark hair in 2 uneven braids and rubber boots too big for her feet, and a purple jacket with a missing button. She came through the gap at the east end of the property and walked straight toward the hives without hesitating. I saw her from 30 yards away, and my first thought was that she was going to get stung. My second thought was that she didn't look scared at all. I moved toward her slowly, the way you move around hives when something unexpected happens. She was standing 4 feet from the nearest box, completely still, watching the bees move in and out of the entrance with total concentration. "You shouldn't be this close," I said, keeping my voice low. She looked up at me, brown eyes, serious face. "Do you know my mom?" she said. I stopped. "I don't think so. What's her name?" She looked back at the hives. "Claire," she said. "She cries at night when she thinks I'm asleep." She paused. "I thought maybe you were the reason." I had no idea what to say to that. I stood in my field with the bees moving around us, and this small, serious girl watching the hives like she was reading something in them. "I don't know your mom," I said carefully. "I'm sorry she's been sad." Sophie considered this. "Do you talk to them?" she said. "The bees." "Sometimes." "Does it help?" "Helps me," I said. "Don't know about them," she almost smiled. "Not quite." She looked at the hives one more time and turned and walked back toward the fence, unhurried, like she'd gotten what she came for. At the gap she stopped and looked over her shoulder. "My mom says bees sting." "They do," I said, "but only when they're scared." She thought about that. Then she slipped through the fence and was gone. I stood in the field for a while after that. She cries at night when she thinks I'm asleep, not a complaint. A fact she'd been carrying and needed to put down somewhere. I found out who Claire Morrow was the way you find out anything in Graymore. Not because I asked, because Walt Briggs mentioned her at the hardware store the following Tuesday while I was buying weather stripping. "Moved in 2 weeks ago," he said. "The old Hester place on Birch Road. Single mom, little girl, came up from Connecticut. Something about a custody situation. Walt said it the way people in small towns say things they know more about than they're letting on." I thanked him for the weather stripping and drove home. I didn't go over to introduce myself. I told myself it wasn't my business. I had my own quiet life, and it suited me fine. But that evening I drove past Birch Road on my way back from the market, and I saw the car in the driveway, a gray sedan with Connecticut plates, the rear left tire visibly low. Not flat yet, but close. Close enough that by morning, in the cold, it would be. I didn't stop. I drove home. I made dinner. I went to bed. At 6 in the morning, I was back on Birch Road with my compressor and a plug kit. The tire was flat by then, all the way down. I worked fast, in the early light, before anyone was up, fixed the seal, inflated it, put everything back in my truck, and drove away without knocking on the door. I didn't think about it again. It was just a flat tire. Anyone would have done it. I was wrong about that. Not everyone would have done it, but I didn't know that yet. The first time I saw Claire properly, not at the market, not from across the field, was a Saturday morning in October. I was repainting the hive stand on box 14 when I heard the gate at the east end of the property, not the gap in the fence that Sophie used, the actual gate. Claire came through carefully, closing it behind her. She was carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She crossed the field slowly, watching where she stepped, keeping her movements small and steady, the way someone does when they've been told to be careful around bees and have decided to actually listen. She stopped about 8 feet away. "Sophie said you'd be out here," she said. She held out one of the mugs. "I didn't know how you took it." "Black is fine," I said. I set down the paintbrush and took the mug. She stood where she was, not coming closer, not stepping back, looking at the hives the way Sophie did sometimes, with a particular focused attention. "She talks about them constantly," Claire said. "The bees." "She's been doing good research," I said, a small smile. "She corrected her teacher last week about colony collapse. Apparently Mrs. Henderson was not entirely accurate." I almost smiled too. "What did Mrs. Henderson say?" "Something about pesticides. Sophie had 17 additional factors." 17? She made a list. We stood there with our coffees. The morning was cool and still, the kind of October morning that smells like wood smoke and cold earth. A forager came back to Hive 14 and landed on the entrance board, and Claire watched it without moving. "Do they know you?" she said. "The bees. They know my smell," I said. "My movements, whether I'm calm or anxious. They're very good at reading what's underneath." She looked at me then. A quick, careful look, then back at the hives. "That sounds exhausting," she said quietly, "being read that well." I looked at the hives too. "You get used to it," I said. "After a while it's easier than pretending." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been pretending for a long time," she said. Not a confession, more like an observation, something she'd noticed about herself and was naming out loud for the first time. I didn't say anything. She drank her coffee. The bees moved around us. After a while she said, "Thank you for the tire." "You found out," I said. "Walt," she said. "He means well." "He does." She looked at me sideways. "You could have knocked." "I didn't want to make it into something," I said. She was quiet again. Then, "It already was something." She said it simply, without drama, like a correction, like something that needed to be accurate. She finished her coffee. She took my mug when I was done. She walked back across the field the same careful way she'd come, watching where she stepped, keeping her movement steady. At the gate she stopped and looked back. "Sophie wants to know if she can help with the painting next time." "Yes," I said. "Good," she said, and closed the gate. Sophie came back on Thursday. This time she had a notebook. She sat down in the same spot in the grass, like she'd marked it somehow, and opened it on her knee. When I walked over, she looked up and said, very seriously, "I'm doing research." "On what?" "Bees." She showed me the notebook. She'd drawn pictures, careful, detailed, more accurate than you'd expect from a 6-year-old. The hexagonal cells of a comb, a bee with its wings spread. She'd labeled them in big block letters: worker, queen, drone. "Where did you learn this?" I said. "Books," she said, "and the internet. Mom lets me use it for school things." She looked at the nearest hive. "Is there really a queen?" "There is." "Does she fly?" "Sometimes, not often." Sophie wrote something in the notebook. "Do the other bees like her?" I thought about that. "They protect her," I said. "Because without her there's no hive. Without her everything falls apart." Sophie wrote that down too. She was quiet for a while, watching the bees. Then, still looking at the hives, she said, "My dad wants me to live with him instead of my mom." I was quiet. "How do you feel about that?" I said carefully. She pressed her lips together. "I don't want to." Her voice was steady, but only just. "My mom needs me." I sat down in the grass a few feet away from her. We watched the hives together for a while, without speaking. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of Vermont morning that smells like frost and pine and something that doesn't have a name. "Your mom is lucky," I said. Sophie looked at me. "You don't know her." "No," I said, "but I know you came back here, and I know you're doing research." Something in her face shifted. A small movement, a fraction of a wall coming down. "She makes good soup," Sophie said, "when I'm sick, and she reads to me even when she's tired. She thinks I fall asleep, but I don't. I like listening to her voice." I looked at this small girl with her notebook and her careful drawings, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. something that had been very quiet for a long time and had just gotten a little louder. "I think she's going to be okay," I said. Sophie looked at me for a long moment. "How do you know?" I looked at the hives. "Because the hive always finds a way," I said. "Even when things get hard, especially then." Sophie wrote that down too. She didn't say anything else. Neither did I. We just sat there in the grass with the bees moving around us, quiet and certain and entirely themselves. I met Claire Morrow on a Friday afternoon, not at my hives but at the farmer's market where I had a table every week. She came with Sophie, who spotted me from across the market and pulled her mother over before Claire had a chance to prepare herself. Sophie said, "This is Eli. He keeps bees. He knows about the queen." Claire looked at me. She was not what I expected, though I'm not sure what I expected. Medium height, dark hair loose around her shoulders, the kind of tired that goes all the way down. She was wearing a coat that was practical, rather than pretty, and she had a smudge of something blue on her right wrist that looked like paint. She had Sophie's same brown eyes, or Sophie had hers, and she looked at me with an expression I'd learned to recognize. Careful, assessing, the look of someone who has gotten good at deciding very quickly whether a person is safe. "Sophie's told me about your bees," she said. Her voice was quieter than I expected. "She's been very thorough." "She has," I said. I held out a jar of clover honey. "For the research." Claire blinked. She looked at Sophie, then back at me. "How much?" "It's not for sale," I said. "It's for the research." Claire looked at the jar for a moment. Then she took it. The look she gave me was complicated, grateful and uncomfortable at the same time. The look of someone who wasn't used to receiving things without conditions attached. "Thank you," she said. She said it like it cost something. I found out later that it did. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. Nothing important. What honey went with what food. Whether Sophie could come back to the hives with proper equipment. Whether the market ran through November. Claire was polite and a little formal and very careful about how much she said. But when Sophie grabbed my hand to show me something at the next stall, and Claire watched it happen, I saw something move across her face. Not suspicion, something much quieter than that. Something that looked almost like relief. The custody hearing was 6 weeks away when I found out what was actually happening. Not from Claire, she wouldn't have told me. I found out from Martha Okafor, who ran the library and knew everything that happened in Graymore within 48 hours of it happening. Claire's ex-husband was named Derek Morrow. He was a corporate attorney in Hartford, successful, well-connected, the kind of man who understood that the law was a tool and he knew how to use it. He was filing for full custody of Sophie on the grounds that Claire had moved to a rural area without stable employment, adequate social support, or a fixed community. He had a long document prepared by a child psychologist he'd hired who had never met Sophie. He had financial projections showing what he could provide and what Claire couldn't. He had a plan. Claire had Sophie and a jar of clover honey and 6 weeks. Sophie came to the hives almost every day after school. Claire started bringing her, waiting at the fence while Sophie came in with her notebook. Then slowly, over several days, coming through the fence herself. She didn't say much at first. She'd stand a little way back and watch Sophie work through her questions with the careful seriousness of a scientist, and I'd answer without making a production of it. One afternoon Claire said, from about 10 feet away, still watching Sophie, "She's not scared of anything." "Not of bees," I said. "Some things," Claire said quietly. "She's scared of some things." I looked over at her. She was watching Sophie with an expression that was equal parts love and worry, and something else I didn't have a word for. "What things?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Losing me," she said, very simply, like it was a fact she'd learned to carry rather than something that surprised her. I didn't say anything. Sophie called out something about a forager bee, and I went to look at what she was pointing at, and the moment passed. But I thought about it later, standing in the kitchen making dinner, the way Claire had said it. Not losing me to Derek or losing the custody case. Just losing me. Like the fear was bigger than the hearing, like Sophie was scared of something that couldn't be fixed by a judge's ruling. Derek Morrow came to Graymore on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the hearing. I saw his car first, a black Mercedes with Connecticut plates, parked outside the Hester place on Birch Road. I was driving past on my way to the supply store, and I almost kept going. Then I saw Claire standing on the porch. Her arms were crossed, her shoulders were up around her ears. Derek stood at the bottom of the steps, well-dressed, relaxed, doing what men like Derek do when they want to demonstrate that they're in control of a situation, without having to say so. I pulled over. I didn't have a plan. I got out of the truck and walked up the path and said, "Claire." She looked at me. Something in her face changed. A quick, complicated shift. Derek turned. He looked at me the way men like Derek look at people like me. Once, briefly, categorically. "You must be the beekeeper," he said. His voice was pleasant, perfectly pleasant. "Derek Morrow, I'm Sophie's father." "I know who you are," I said. He smiled. "Then you know this is a family matter." "I know Sophie's inside," I said, "and I know she can probably hear this conversation." Something moved behind Derek's eyes. Not anger. He was too controlled for anger. Something colder than that. He looked at Claire. "We'll continue this later," he said. Then he looked at me one more time, the same brief, categorical look, and walked back to his car. Claire stood on the porch after he left. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "He's going to use you," she said, "against me." "How?" "He'll say I'm unstable, that I'm building a life around a man Sophie barely knows, that it's not a suitable environment." She paused. "He's not wrong that we barely know each other. He's wrong about the rest," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were very tired and very clear at the same time. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm going to anyway." There was a week in October, 2 weeks before the hearing, when things got difficult in a way that didn't have anything to do with Derek. It was a Tuesday. I'd spent the morning doing hive inspections and the afternoon trying to catch up on honey orders I'd fallen behind on. I was at the bottling station in the barn around 4 when I heard Sophie's voice in the field. She wasn't at her usual spot. She was standing at the edge of the hive yard, closer than usual, and she was very still. I came out and saw immediately that something was wrong. She had her arms wrapped around herself, and her face was that particular flat expression children get when they're working very hard not to cry. A bee was moving around her head, probably drawn by something in her hair, and she wasn't running, which told me how upset she was. Running would have been the normal thing. She was standing completely still, watching it, and her jaw was very tight. I walked over slowly. I cupped my hand and redirected the bee away from her. A gentle deflection, nothing dramatic, and then I crouched down so we were at the same level. "Hey," I said, "what happened?" She shook her head. Her lips were pressed together. "Sophie," she looked at me. Her eyes were very bright. "My dad called," she said. "He said," she stopped. Her voice had gotten very small. "He said I'm going to like it in Hartford when I come to live with him." I was quiet. "That's not what's going to happen," I said carefully. "How do you know?" she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly. She pulled it back immediately. This child who had been managing her own fear for long enough that she'd gotten very good at not letting it show. I thought about what to say. I've never been good at the right words for hard things, but I'd learned something from 11 years of bees. You don't lie to them. They always know. "I don't know for certain," I said. "Nobody does yet. But I know your mom is fighting as hard as she knows how, and I know that courts look at what's actually true, not just what people say." Sophie looked at me. "And what's actually true?" she said. "That your mom is the person you run to," I said. "When you're scared, when you're happy, when you find out something new about bees." A small, reluctant twitch at the corner of her mouth. "I ran to you when the bee was near my head." "That's different," I said. "That's a bee emergency." She almost smiled. Then it faded. I'm scared, she said, very quietly, like it cost her something to say it. I know, I said. Me too. She looked at me, surprised. You're scared? Some things are worth being scared about, I said. Doesn't mean they're going to go wrong. Just means they matter. She thought about that. Then she sat down in the grass, her spot, the one she'd claimed in September, and opened her notebook. I sat beside her. We didn't talk much after that. She drew. I watched the hives. The afternoon light moved across the field. After a while, Sophie said, without looking up, Eli, yeah, I'm glad you live next door. I looked at her bent over the notebook, tongue at the corner of her mouth, drawing something careful and exact. Me too, I said. Me too. 2 weeks before the hearing, Derek's lawyers filed an affidavit. It included my divorce records, a statement from a former colleague of Rachel's who described my withdrawal from social life after the marriage ended, and a characterization of me as a reclusive and emotionally volatile individual who represented an unstable influence on a child in a vulnerable situation. I read it at my kitchen table on a Thursday morning. Then I put it down and went out to the hives. I worked until the afternoon, checking frames, replacing a damaged box on Hive 7, repainting the stand on Hive 12. The kind of work that keeps your hands busy and gives your head somewhere to go. I heard the truck in the driveway around 3, then footsteps across the field. Claire appeared at the edge of the hive yard, still in her work clothes. She'd started taking on graphic design projects from home, building a client list, the kind of quiet, steady work that didn't show up well in Derek's documents but was real. She had Sophie's notebook in her hand. She left this here yesterday, Claire said. Then, looking at me carefully, have you read it? Yes, I said. I'm sorry. She shook her head. It's not your fault. She looked at the hives. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, tell me something. What? Why did you fix my tire? I went still. Walt, I said. She almost smiled. Walt, she confirmed. He saw you. I looked at Hive 7. It was flat, I said. I noticed it driving past. You had Connecticut plates. You probably didn't know what the cold does overnight. Eli. Her voice was quiet. Why did you fix it? I was quiet for a long moment. The bees moved around us, unhurried, purposeful. Because it needed fixing, I said, and I was there. She looked at me, that careful, assessing look she had, but different now, like she'd already done the assessing and was looking at something else. You didn't knock, she said. No, you didn't tell me. No. Why? I looked at her. Because I didn't do it for the thank you, I said. She was quiet. Then she walked forward, slowly, carefully, until she was standing beside me at Hive 7. She looked at the bees moving in and out of the entrance. She was close enough that I could see the smudge of blue paint on her wrist again. The same one from the market, or a new one, I couldn't tell. I've spent 2 years, she said slowly, not trusting kindness. Because every time someone was kind to me, there was something underneath it. She paused. Derek was very kind at the beginning. I didn't say anything. I don't know what to do with someone who just fixes things, she said, without making it into something. She looked at me sideways. It's disorienting. I can be more of a problem if that helps, I said. She laughed. A real one, short and surprised, and nothing like the careful smile she'd been using since the market. She put her hand over her mouth like she hadn't expected it. We stood there beside Hive 7 in the afternoon light. The laugh faded. Something else settled in its place, quieter, heavier. Her hand dropped from her mouth. She looked at the hives. I looked at the hives. Neither of us moved for a long time. Then she reached over, slowly, carefully, and put her hand over mine on the edge of the box. Just that, nothing else. Her fingers were cold. I didn't move. The bees moved around us, indifferent, purposeful, entirely themselves. Thank you, she said, very quietly, not about the tire, about all of it. Thank you. The hearing was on a Tuesday in November. The courthouse in Burlington was old and cold, and smelled like floor wax and old paper. Derek sat at one table with 2 lawyers and a thick folder of documents. Claire sat at the other table with her lawyer, a woman named Patricia who had been recommended by Martha at the library and who had prepared a careful, thorough case. Sophie was with Claire's neighbor during the hearing, but she'd hugged me so hard that morning that I'd felt it in my ribs. Derek's team went first. They were precise and professional and very good at making the truth sound like something else. They talked about Claire's lack of community ties, her unstable employment history, her decision to uproot Sophie from her school and her friends. They talked about the rural isolation of Graymore. They mentioned me, the reclusive neighbor, the failed marriage, the months of withdrawal. They made it all sound very reasonable, very concerned. Patricia presented Claire's case clearly and well. The new client list, the school reports showing Sophie was thriving, the statements from Martha at the library and from Sophie's new teacher, who had written that Sophie was one of the most intellectually engaged students she'd taught in 20 years. When Patricia finished, the judge looked at his papers for a long moment. Then he looked up. "Is there anything else?" he said. Claire's hand was on the table. I saw it trembling, just slightly. Derek sat back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. I stood up. I hadn't planned to. I hadn't prepared anything. Patricia looked at me, surprised, uncertain, but didn't stop me. The judge looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Shaw, I'd like to say something," I said, "if that's permitted." The judge studied me for a moment. "Briefly," he said. I looked at my hands. I'm not a man who gives speeches. I've never been good at finding the right words for the important things. But I'd spent 11 years talking to bees, and I'd learned that the important thing wasn't eloquence. It was honesty. "Sophie Morrow came into my field in September," I said. "She walked through a gap in my fence without asking, sat down in the grass next to 42 hives, and started doing research." I heard Claire make a small sound. "She had a notebook," I said. "She'd drawn the cells of a honeycomb from memory. She'd labeled the castes, worker, queen, drone, in block letters. She was 6 years old. She told me her mom cries at night when she thinks she's asleep. She said it like a fact she'd been carrying and needed to put down somewhere. And then she asked me if the bees liked their queen." Derek's lawyer shifted in his seat. Derek himself was very still. "I told her the bees protect their queen," I said, "because without her there's no hive. Without her everything falls apart." I looked at the judge. "Sophie Morrow knows that already. She's known it since before she could name it. You can see it in the way she stands next to her mother, in the way she checks on her." "I don't have a folder of documents," I said. "I can't tell you about income projections or social support networks. What I can tell you is what I've seen. A woman who shows up for her daughter every day, even when she's exhausted, even when she's scared, even when she's fighting a battle she's not sure she can win. And a little girl who is curious and careful and brave in the specific way children are brave when they feel safe enough to be." I stopped. The courtroom was quiet. "Sophie doesn't need more," I said. "She needs her mother. And she has her, every day, completely, without reservation. That's not something any document can replace." I sat down. My hands were shaking. Claire was looking at the table. Derek was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not the contempt I expected, something more complicated than that. The judge looked at his papers for a long time. Then he looked up. "I've heard enough," he said. He reviewed each aspect of the case in turn. Methodical, thorough, unhurried. When he reached his conclusion, his voice was clear and even. "Custody is awarded to the mother. Full custody with structured visitation rights for the father, to be arranged through mediation." Claire put her face in her hands. Patricia put a hand on her shoulder. Derek sat very still for a moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without looking at me. I sat there for a moment. The courtroom was getting louder around me. Voices, movement, the shuffle of papers. But it felt very quiet where I was sitting. Like the moment after a hive settles, when everything that needed to happen has happened and the bees go back to their work. We stood outside afterward in the thin November sunlight. Claire still had her hand over her mouth. She'd been crying, quietly, the way she did most things, and her eyes were red and her mascara had done what mascara does, and she didn't look anything like the careful, composed woman who had come to the market with a paint smudge on her wrist. She looked like herself. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. You weren't prepared." "No. It was—" She stopped, started again. "It was the truest thing anyone has said about us in 2 years." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. We stood in the thin sunlight for a while. Patricia had given us space. The other lawyers were gone. The street was quiet, the way Vermont streets are quiet in November. A particular, specific, unglamorous quiet that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with the fact that winter is coming and there's work to do. Claire looked at me. "I need to get Sophie," she said. "She'll be terrified until she hears." "Go," I said. She started to turn. Then she stopped. She turned back. She looked at me for a long moment. That careful, assessing look, the one she'd had since the market. But different again. Like something behind it had finally settled. Like a question she'd been asking for a long time had just been answered. She stepped forward and put her arms around me, not dramatically, just held on, her face against my shoulder, her cold hands against my back. I stood there for a second, surprised. Then I put my arms around her and held on too. We stood like that on the courthouse steps in the November cold for a moment. That was the length of something important, and then she pulled back and looked at me one more time and said, "Thank you, Eli." And then she walked toward her car, quick and certain, to go get her daughter. The week after the hearing was quiet. Not the empty kind I'd lived in for 3 years. A different kind. Fuller. The kind that comes after something important has settled. Claire came on Thursday with coffee. She'd started doing that without announcing it. She stood beside Hive 7 and looked at the bees. "The mediation starts next month," she said. "Derek's agreed to 3 weekends a month in Hartford. How do you feel about that?" "Relieved and sad for Sophie. And—" she paused. "Glad it's over." A forager landed on the edge of her mug and she went very still, watching it, and didn't flinch. It left. Claire let out a small breath. "Sophie will be insufferable when I tell her I did that." "You held still," I said. "That's harder than it sounds." She looked at me. Not the careful assessing look anymore. Something else. The way she looked at things she'd decided she trusted. "I'm staying," she said. "In Graymore." I wasn't sure for a while. "But Sophie loves it. And I—" She stopped, started again. "I love it too." I looked at the 42 hives in the November field. "Good," I said. She looked back at the hives. We stood there with our coffees until they went cold, neither of us minding. The drive back to Graymore took 40 minutes. I drove in the particular quiet of someone who has nothing left to say and doesn't need to. The hills were bare, the light was flat. I thought about the affidavit, about emotionally volatile and reclusive and withdrawal from social life. The months after Rachel left, the ones they'd described accurately, the ones I was still a little ashamed of. I thought about how long I'd spent keeping my world very small, because small couldn't leave you. I thought about a 6-year-old walking through a gap in my fence and sitting down in the grass like she'd always belonged there. By the time I got back to Graymore, the light was going. The hives were quiet in the field, 42 of them, dark against the pale grass, the bees inside in their winter clusters, keeping the queen warm. They didn't need me right now. They were fine. They knew what to do. Sophie came to the hives 2 days later. She came alone. Claire had started letting her make the short walk on her own, which meant something. She came through the gap in the fence the same way she always had, unhurried, like she knew where she was going. She sat down in her spot in the grass. She had the notebook. I finished what I was doing on Hive 3 and walked over. She was drawing again, a new page, a detailed sketch of a winter cluster. She'd gotten the shape right, the way the bees pressed together at the center, the queen at the heart of it. "You did your research," I said. "I always do my research," she said. She didn't look up, she kept drawing. Then, still drawing, she said, "Mom told me what you said, in the courthouse." I sat down in the grass beside her. "Yeah?" She said, "You told them about my notebook." "I did, and about the queen." Yes. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Her pencil moved carefully across the page. Why? She said. Because it was true, I said, and it mattered. She thought about that. Her tongue moved to the corner of her mouth the way it did when she was thinking hard. Then she looked up at me. My mom says bees sting, she said. I looked at her. I knew what she was doing. They do, I said, but only when they're scared. Sophie held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at her notebook. A small smile moved across her face. Just briefly, just enough. She's not scared anymore, she said. She said it simply, like a fact she'd been carrying and had just put down. She went back to her drawing. I looked out at the hives, at the 42 boxes in the pale November field, quiet and certain, doing what they'd always done. I thought about the morning she'd walked through the fence and sat down in the grass and asked me if I knew her mom. I thought about how I'd said no, how I'd been right then, how completely wrong I was now. The morning light moved across the field. Sophie's pencil moved across the page. The bees did what bees do, steady, purposeful, entirely themselves. And somewhere on Birch Road, in the old Hester place with the bad fence and the cracked porch step I'd been meaning to fix, Claire Morrow was probably at her desk with a paint smudge on her wrist, building something that was going to last. I hadn't been looking for any of this, but it had walked through my fence one September morning and sat down in the grass, and somewhere between then and now it had become the truest thing in my life. Sophie finished her drawing. She closed the notebook and looked up at me. Can I come back tomorrow? Yes, I said. Good. She stood up and brushed the grass off her jacket. She started toward the fence. At the gap she stopped, the same way she always stopped, and looked back over her shoulder. Eli? Yeah, Fall. She's not scared anymore, she said again. Softer this time, like she wanted to make sure I heard it. I heard it. I watched her slip through the gap in the fence and disappear down the path toward Birch Road. Then I turned back to the hives. 42 of them in the November field, quiet and certain, the queen at the center of each one, everything holding.